Welcome everyone to this new great talk on defending human rights at the multilateral level, the practitioner's perspective on political, economic, and social rights. And well, humanity is facing a number of challenges. One of them is the immediate threat of COVID that is hitting us day to day and has not yet been solved. In the longer term, but that requires action today, is the climate change challenge. Today we all read the COP26 Just Transition Declaration. And when hearing some of reactions in the radio, I noticed that some consider that is still a lot of blah, 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 and that there is no certainty that actions will follow the declaration. And of course, besides the immediate and long-term challenges, humanity also faces a long-standing challenge that at the turn of the millennium triggered the United Nations Millennium Declaration that oddly reminds us the Paris Declaration and this COP26 declaration. And I quote, "The heads of state and government have gathered at United Nations headquarters in New York from 6 to 8 September 2000 and recognized that in addition to their separate responsibilities to their individual societies, they had a collective responsibility to uphold the principles of human dignity, equality, and equity at the global level. They also recognized as leaders that they had a duty, therefore, to all the world's people, especially the most vulnerable, and in particular, the children of the world to whom the future belongs." And this, of course, has been taken and retaken in many declarations. In the COVID-19 and in the climate change and in human rights, we have had the declarations, but has the action followed? Will the action follow? And as they say, vision without action is just a dream. Action without a vision just passes the time, but vision with action can change the world. So in today's great talk, we have two passionate, active actors in the field of human rights. We have Adrian Soler, who is a political scientist in international relations. He's a management consultant, trained in the Netherlands, has created and run in Geneva several international non-governmental organizations in the social sector. He is an expert and trainer in the field of human rights and has a long experience in the international world in Geneva. Adrien-Claude Zoller is co-founder of the Swiss section of Pax Christi International Catholic Movement for Peace. He was co-founder of SOS-Torture, World Organization Against Torture. He was founder and director of the International Service for Human Rights. And since 2003, he's president of the Geneva Human Rights Global Training. Now, our other panelist, Tor Holland, has over 25 years of professional experience in the field of human rights. He presently serves as Chief Right to Development, Sustainable Development, and Economic and Social Rights Branch of the Thematic Engagement, Special Procedures, and Right to Development Division of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva. He has served as representative of the OHCHR in Colombia, in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Angola, and he also held other human rights positions with the United Nations in Rwanda, Equatorial Guinea, Geneva, and New York. So with this, I will just give the floor for some practical indications to Manuela Tortora, and then you will have the floor, Todd, and then, of course, Mr. Adrian Soler. Manuela, please, the floor.
Yes. Thank you very much, Alejandro. Welcome, everybody. As you can see, we have a screen more or less full today. So please, to improve the sound, particularly for those who have not a very good quality connection, please keep your mics closed and try to write your comments or your short questions in a short way in the chat column. Of course, after the presentations of the two panelists, I will try to moderate and to put some order in the questions and comments insofar as I can. And if needed, I will give the floor for further clarifications to all of you as participants. Let's just start, Todd, with you and with my very personal remark that I just opened minutes ago the website of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And just looking at the diversity of topics, the news that are there, I just get scared. So I wonder really how you manage your life at the office. But Todd, the floor is yours, and then we will give the floor to Mr. Zoller. Todd, please.
Thank you very much, Manuela. Thank you, Alejandro, and thanks to GREYTALK for the invitation. I also very much appreciate being on this GREYTALKs with Professor Zoller, a very respected human rights practitioner. I'll start by saying this morning, I received a chat message from a colleague who works for the UN in Colombia, and he just wrote, "No time to rest." And I thought to myself, what is he talking about? And it took me a little bit at 6 in the morning to think like, oh, he's talking about the GREYTALKs and the idea that there is no time to rest. And I wrote back to him saying, well, we better find a little bit of time to rest, because we certainly need to find some time to think. Because the challenges that we're facing today globally are so incredibly difficult and complex. And it's so important to see how we, as the human rights movement, and specifically how human rights can be defended at the multilateral level, actually has an impact. Because we're in a moment where, to a large degree, certain individuals, let's say the popular conception of human rights is very limited often to other people in other places. But the whole idea of human rights is it's relevant for each and every one of us in our relationship with society. It's a fundamental part of the social contract. But for somehow, the idea, the popular conception is really thinking about human rights in different terms. And we have to somehow recapture the spirit of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That was clear that the Declaration set out what was needed to be free from fear and free from want. And that both of these aspects of human rights were so important. And that human rights would actually form guardrails on all sectors, all organs of society. And that all parts of society were also to work together to achieve those objectives. It sounds very good, but it seems like to a large degree what's happened is that there's huge exemptions or holes relative to these organs in society that are, not necessarily taking on human rights as the type of guardrails that are needed to create the appropriate policies so that people benefit and people's rights are respected, and that we see over time, for example, an improvement in the level of respect for economic rights, whether that's right to health, education, social protection. I think part of the problem, and that we've seen it, and we've heard, for example, from the director of CIPOL or ECLAC, speaking about this problem of how the concentration of power, wealth, and influence is having a significant influence on our world today. And that it's having an impact on how individuals, the confidence they have in government institutions, including the United Nations. Lots of people felt left out, left behind. And while the UN, we have a lot of, important rhetoric, the reality is people are feeling left out of the benefits of development because the concentration of power and inequalities are growing and growing, and we're leaving too many people behind. And the reference of Alejandro relative to COVID and how this has exacerbated the inequalities is certainly very important. COVID also has shown that misinformation is free today. The social networks are full of misinformation. But scientific information is still part of a business model that costs money. how are we taking seriously the Universal Declaration that understood that science needed to be something that was shared so that we could all advance? But we've fallen into different ways of operating that really are problematic for our rights. I think one of the challenges as well is that the United Nations was developed at a time when nation states perhaps were the most important entities, the most powerful entities. But today we really see that power is not just exercised by member states. We see significant power in corporations, significant influence on our rights. I mean, if we're to talk about Facebook and the influence they have in terms of how people that are using this particular mode of communication can create a whole different reality. And that different reality can be extremely dangerous in terms of whether that's public health or whether that could be some type of mob mentality, some type of racism. We have a real challenge that we're facing in terms of how does the multilateral system cope with the fact that power is so unequally distributed, and there's 26 individuals that have almost as much wealth as half the population of the world. We have a challenge in terms of how are those people represented, and how are the values and the principles of the United Nations actually affecting those people and the people that are benefiting from the current reality. There's no easy solution, but part of it is that the United Nations needs to go back to the spirit in which it was created, to benefit people. And I don't think that we need to be afraid to say that the vision that was created in the Universal Declaration is not being respected by any country at this moment. I think it's important that we go beyond the rhetoric related to building back better, that we understand that there is a need to somehow create a different narrative. And that narrative has to be that human rights are relevant to our lives. And that how do we do that, and how does that then affect the work of multilateral institutions? It would have a huge impact. But now, if human rights are, let's say, less and less relevant for the views of people, how does the multilateral entity, how does the multilateral efforts actually make a difference? If they're falling in a situation where this concentration of power is reinforcing the status quo, and then there is a use of that political power and personal wealth, how do we get beyond that? How do we get beyond the idea of this, let's say, the feeling of alienation, when in fact people who are alienated seem to be attracted to that political program? How do we get those values to recapture what governments are supposed to do and what the multilateral organizations were created to do, which was to create cooperation to see and realize these principles? I don't think that there is any easy route for where we are today, and that to some degree the organization needs to get beyond simply saying what needs to happen. And I know that we make significant efforts in many different ways within the system. But we see the situation becoming more and more dire. So when Manuel and Alejandro spoke to me and said it should be like a conversation between people, and that what I wanted to do then with the opening remarks was to put out some very difficult problems that we're facing, and then hopefully through the chat and through your experience, I can gain something in terms of, how do we actually confront and advance in this particular moment. So I want to thank you for the opportunity and look forward to hearing from all of you in terms of ideas on how do we rise to the challenge. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Todd, for these concerns that are shared, I think, by everybody here. I would like to immediately give the floor to Professor Zoller for his own views and experience in this regard, and also his overall experience in the mechanism, the machinery of the human rights at the UN from the point of view of an NGO. The floor is yours, Mr. Zoller.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm also very glad to be with you, and I'm thankful for this invitation. I would like to make some remarks on what we have seen over the last 70 years. And I will start with one comment made by one NGO this afternoon in the special session on of the Human Rights Council on Sudan. There was one NGO starting to blame the UN for what they did 2 years ago because they stopped an investigation and a monitoring of the situation in Sudan. And that NGO, the name of the NGOs is UN Watch, obviously has still not understood what is the UN. So from time to time, we have to repeat it. UN are states. We as non-governmental actors, we obtain some possibilities to interact. But I mean, it is an organization of states. Gradually, the Secretariat got expertise, which it did not have at the beginning. But I mean, the expertise is now present. The office of the High Commissioner in Geneva is no longer only there to take the notes, make minutes, and prepare a report. It has the knowledge on many issues. And unfortunately, on the side of some NGOs, I mean, the number of increase of NGOs, but the quality did not necessarily increase. So we are in a process over the last 70 years with ups and downs, and it started with obviously the standard setting, what we call the standard setting. It was probably the most easy one to draft a declaration, then some treaties, and then trying to have already some monitoring mechanism in these first treaties. This was the treaty monitoring bodies. Then the Secretariat, who had no power at the beginning, the Secretariat received complaints, received petitions, and could not deal with petitions. The Commission on Human Rights, in 47 even decided that the Commission was not competent to deal with the complaints received. This is what the scientists, the academics, called the non-power doctrine. And for 47, from 47 to 57, 67, sorry, 58, 59, there was a silence. And gradually it was broken. And it was broken because the bodies had to deal with it, and the bodies were under the influence, the pressure of the Secretariat, the NGOs, and the victims. This led to a decision to have public debates on the grave violations, not all the violations, and then to have a procedure on confidential procedure, to deal confidentially with the complaints received. It was in 67 and in 1970. But there was another factor, and the factor was that some countries, some states took the lead. And unfortunately, contrary to what we believe, these were not the Western countries. The first country to take the lead was India. India became a member of the UN and immediately started to raise the issue of apartheid. It could not do it successfully in the Commission, so it did it in the General Assembly, obtained resolutions and a series of resolutions which led to a convention on apartheid, even two conventions, by the way, because there is also a convention on apartheid in sport. Then later you had the Arab states who took the lead on Palestine and the occupied territories by Israel. And then many Latin American states include, and together with the Soviet bloc, took the lead on Chile. And so these were three exceptions to this rule of sovereignty of the states. So this was another factor. You had each time with the support of the Secretariat, with the support of the experts. There was a group of experts of this called the Subcommission, and gradually the Commission on Human Rights, the Economic and Social Council, the General Assembly adopted a resolution, created some mechanism. It started at the initiatives of countries of the South. It started on the issue of what to do with violations. And then when it was no longer possible to obtain a consensus on a particular country, it started to become issues. The failure of the Commission to adopt a resolution on Argentina led to a resolution on enforced disappearances, and it was the creation of the first thematic procedure. I just wanted to remind this at the beginning because this has been a process which we see the day of today as well. It continues. These are other topics because topics have been forgotten, for instance, during the Cold War. The topics of slavery, colonialism, and is now a topic which is emerging very strongly in the United Nations through the Afro-American issues. And we would like to see more initiatives taken by states on the issue of racism, and not only for the Afro descent, but also for Asian descent, who have been also the victim of COVID manifestation and strong reprisals in America, but also in many other countries, including in Europe. So that's this process, which is quite interesting. At a certain moment, a state is a good guy. And at a certain moment, the same state is not a good guy. And I wish really to remind people that at the beginning, those who were slowing down, not to say opposing, this building up of the process of special procedures have been the Western European countries. The position of countries such as Greece, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and obviously it was the period of the 60s, 70s, but I mean, these countries have been slowing down the process of the establishment of the special procedure. For instance, India could not obtain a majority in the Commission on Human Rights, which was composed mainly of Western European countries. So India had to go to the General Assembly. The new independent countries joining the UN has given this push. At this moment, these European countries are more positive and contribute to some positive steps in the Human Rights Council. And other countries are constituting major obstacles. It is due to a change in geopolitics. It is due to factors such as the end of the Cold War, And some people believe that it would be the beginning of the paradise. But they forgot that during the Cold War, we had neglected all the issues. Look at the history of the UN. The new international economic order was a debate in the 60s, and it is now the debate. It is a debate when the president today, when opening our meeting, speaks about the Millennium Declaration. The Millennium Declaration is a follow-up to the World Conference on Human Rights in '93. And it is followed by this process of reform of Kofi Annan, which leads to the 2005 Summit of Heads of States. And it is followed now with the Sustainable Development Goals. This is a new debate. You cannot, as a Western country, continue to say, sorry, it does not belong to the agenda of the Human Rights Council. Please go to another forum because the IMF, the World Bank, or the Economic and Social Council are dealing with such issues. These are issues connected with human rights, linking the situations to violations. And moreover, as it has been said by the first speaker today, I mean, states are not the only entities creating problems in the field of human rights. The big companies it is a problem which has to be taken seriously. There is a link between the economic system and the violations, and we have to take it more seriously. As long as the United Nations does not find a way to fight effectively against extreme poverty, to eradicate extreme poverty, as long as it does not happen, there will be no more support to the United Nations in the field of human rights. So this was the message I was going to start with in this dialogue.
Thank you very much, Professor Zoller. Quite a strong message, I must say. And I think it opens the door and the minds to many, many reflections. In order maybe to stimulate some comments or questions, I would like to start by raising my own comments and reactions. The first one related to what Todd said, but also then you complemented regarding the role of the states, the state-driven UN system, and what Todd said, try to recapture the values that were at the origins of the UN and the Human Rights Declaration and everything that follows. In that regard, from my perspective, I don't know if I am too optimistic or utopian, I don't know. The role of the civil society seems to be growing in the last few 20, 25 years, maybe, as compared to my own generation within the system. I mean, as a player within the system. It is what Professor Richard Jolly used to label the third UN. So the first being the states, the second being the secretariats, and the third UN being the civil society. We had that topic of the role of the civil society in our intergenerational dialogue organized by Grace Sells a few months ago in June. And we discovered a lot of areas where the civil society managed to have victories, sometimes small victories, sometimes painful victories, but something is done and is delivered by the actions of the civil society. So I'm asking both of you, Professor Zoller and Todd, do you think that in maybe the medium, long term, the role of this third UN will be the main force driving to a more efficient UN machinery, UN role in the broad defense of human rights? Question mark? Question to both of you, of course.
Manuela, who do you want to go first there? It's a very important question. and perhaps I didn't articulate fully a thought related, is that in a way, human rights are both an objective and a tool. And being a tool, it's extremely important that these tools are operationalized by individuals. And the most often, let's say most often, what we see is activists, human rights defenders, taking these principles and pushing their government or another powerful entity, for example, a business organization, to respect their rights. And respect could either come through stopping an action or taking an action. One of the challenges that we're faced with today is, is the mechanisms that we've created both accessible and useful to civil society organizations helping to facilitate the changes that are needed in their societies. It is a big question, and that really, I'm sure we would get a mixed answer if we spoke to different organizations. And I think also whether or not the human rights principles are useful in achieving the changes that different activists are seeking. We like to believe that human rights is a powerful transformative tool, and that we've seen it time and time and again in different parts of the world. But we've also seen how the UN can be less effective in certain areas of rights where there are powerful interests at play. So I would say that the importance of civil society and all actors to actually be able to use the human rights framework is critical to its success, and to have access to the mechanisms that have been created by member states, because it's through that type of advocacy that we can see some positive change being facilitated in our world. So thanks for the opportunity.
Professor Zoller, you would like to certainly to add, to comment on that?
Yeah, just maybe some short points. First is human rights organizations should be limited to groups, individuals, groups who are ready to denounce any violation, and not only some violations. As long as it is not clear this, the civil society contribution to the UN programs in the field of human rights is diminishing. There are more and more interventions at the United Nations made by NGO speakers who are not made by human rights organizations and defenders, but by civil society representatives. So I want to make this very clear. The second point is that NGOs are important and their role can even increase on one condition. It is that they come with concrete proposals. So it is necessary to denounce and to repeat, because delegates of governments often know what happens, but they prefer to ignore or neglect the issues. So we have to repeat, and we have learned this from all the victims in the regions, in particular with the famous case of the mothers of Plaza de Mayo, with whom I've been working at the beginning of the 80s. That's really very important to come, besides the repetition, to come with the concrete proposals. The proposal can be made more easily by a victim than by a human rights expert, because the victim knows exactly what is the abuse and they know how to stop it. Third is important also that the big NGOs cultivate also this sense of the access. Todd, you raise the issue of the access and the access to international system. He is also depending on international NGOs who should be more available to the NGOs from the regions. You see a trend at this moment amongst the special rapporteurs, amongst many studies made in the UN, amongst diplomats also, to listen more to NGOs inside the country than to international NGOs. We have to find the bridge. We have to help these authentic voices to be heard in Geneva. And the COVID crisis has been really a big difficulty. I don't know if NGOs have more impact than they have before. They had the highest impact probably in the World Conference on Human Rights, and to some extent also in other world conferences such as Durban and now in Glasgow. But in the field of human rights, we would have to link this impact with the subject dealt with by the NGOs. And the question is, what are the main challenges? And the main challenges is to include the non-state actors in the system, in the monitoring, in the realization of human rights. These are the climate, environment issues, because it is our survival which is at stake. And these are on these issues that we should give more human rights impact and commitment. Extreme poverty, I mentioned already.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Zoller. We have here in the chat column a question by Ricardo Espinosa regarding precisely what you just mentioned, the role of the victims, the individuals that really know what is the violation and how to address it. And Ricardo is asking, is saying that there is an urgent need to reduce the gap between the time of the victims and the time of the mechanisms to pronounce on the violation of their rights. Years and years can pass before a victim sees his case resolved, and in the best cases, sometimes also, usually, often rejected by the accused country. So what are the possible solutions to reduce the time of the victims as opposed to the time of the mechanisms? That would help a lot to the UN credibility, I think, to the credibility and the impact, of course, of the machinery.
If I may react immediately, the first is implementation inside the country. So our work here in Geneva, now in my case with different organizations for about 40 years, my work is not aimed at obtaining a resolution only. My work is aimed at obtaining that the resolution be implemented. And the second remark I'd like to make on this is that the mothers and grandmothers of Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, once they obtained their convention, once they obtained that Argentina ratified this convention and submitted its report, you know what they did? They said that they continued to work in the UN for the disappeared people in Sri Lanka, in South Korea, and they went there, to explain and to draw, and they are currently at the basis of the World Coalition on relatives of disappeared persons. Why do I say so? I say so because most of the time, victims, more than international NGOs, are aware that despite the fact that they have to wait for their case, they are also aware that they contribute to avoid other similar cases in future. They avoid the repetition for other victims. And this is also part of the training courses we give in the field to victims. This is a movement. The movement is not visible in Geneva. The movement is visible in the coalitions, in the networks of NGOs in Asia, in Africa, and in Latin America. And this is the future. This is really the good sign of hope for human rights, that coalitions, network are existing in the field, and not only for a session of the Human Rights Council.
Thank you, Professor Zoller. Todd, you would like to add something on this time of the machinery, as opposed to the time of the victim?
Yes, thank you. Sure, thanks, Manuela. You know, Ricardo points out an important issue, and it's not easy to say how it's possible to shorten the times of the response, because each of the committees that have let's say a binding protocol that allows for individual complaint mechanisms has a secretariat usually of 1 to 3 people. This is the money that's provided by the member states. So if there is a desire to increase the rapidity of the response, it's important that there's more support to processing the many complaints that come in. But I would like to point out that the use of the mechanisms by victims and NGOs, it's extremely important that it's only one part of their multifaceted strategy. And that at times, what's most important is getting a communication out of the office or out of the United Nations to the particular country. You know, the immediate request for more information that could take place within a matter of weeks. The decision may take years because it requires the balancing or the reviewing of the information provided by the complaint, the review of the information then provided by the state, and then an interpretation of that by the committee members. But there is some value, and I think that's why the mechanisms are so frequently used by victims and advocacy organizations, because they can get a letter out fairly quickly in terms of asking what's going on in this particular case. It's not the decision. Obviously, the decision will provide greater leverage in their advocacy in their particular country. But that what's important, I think, is that there's an understanding of the limitations, and also that the advocate, when they're using the system, uses it in a way that helps to bolster their other advocacy that's being done. And that I know it's not an easy process, but some activists have been quite good at being able to create that type of dynamic where their complaint is filed. They know the procedure that eventually or fairly quickly there'll be a letter sent out to the member state asking for further information. They can use that understanding of the way in which the process works to push for their issue. Again, it's not perfect, and Ricardo, it's true. It's possible to reduce those times, but it would require more resources and investment in the process. Thanks. Back to you, Manuela.
Thank you so much, Todd. If there are no other comments on this specific question, in the meanwhile, I would like to give the floor to Alejandro, because he has a question related to this or other topics that we already approached. Alejandro, please.
Yes, thank you very, very much, Manuela. Well, just like 3 weeks ago, our honorary president and many other talented people in Geneva, they launched what it's called the GESDA, Geneva Science and Diplomatic Anticipator. We had the chance to participate, and something that struck me was the last word, anticipator. So anticipating what would be the impact of the advance of technology and what would be the requirements in the multilateral system. They produce what they call the GESDA radar, of what the world would look like in 20, 30, or 50 years. And I made a search, and there was not a single word about human rights. And I think they're considering some ways indirectly, but in the future that has been shaped there and anticipating, there are no human rights. And hearing about denouncing, repeating complaints and reviewing, I wonder if in the human rights field, there would not be also a need to have a mechanism to anticipate issues, to learn from the past, but to anticipate, as the Mothers del Cinco de Mayo did it, just how we could anticipate. Of course, I was extremely surprised and appalled that there are so many resources put now by the private and the public sector in developing quantum computers and in extending lifespan. And just a last word, there was a survey among those participating in the Just a Launch, and in somebody were present and many, many online. And when they were told that life expectancy would be extended to certainly 120 years in the near future, if they wanted to live those many years. And many of the responses were, I would not like to live those many years if I will be in poverty. I would not like to live those many years that are predicted if there would be discrimination, if ageism is going to be strengthened and the respect of older people will not be respected. I don't want really to spend more lifetime being without access to effective access to my human rights. So indirectly it was there, but I wonder, or possibly it's my lack of knowledge in the field, isn't the promotion and the elimination of obstacles in human rights too reactive? It couldn't be more proactive to anticipate? What do you think? Thank you.
Both Professor Zoller, Todd, whoever would like to reply. Professor Zoller, maybe?
The human rights movement and the system of human rights of the UN has not been only reactive. It has been proactive. The UN system, if I take only the UN bodies, you will find in the history and currently still groups of experts for the treaty bodies, for instance, for certain mechanisms of the Human Rights Council, who are dealing with current problems, analyzing and taking steps in order to avoid future problems. The whole discussion on sustainable development goals, it is like the discussion currently in Glasgow. The SDGs have a date. After this date, it means it will be too late. In Glasgow, they have a date. After this date, it will be too late. So basically, there is already such an element contained in all the work done by the UN bodies, by the NGOs, avoiding the recurrence. It is a fundament of what we call transitional justice. It is not only a justice in transition, but it is a system by which we are all convinced that if we don't deal with the past, we have no future, because it will start again. So on many issues, we are dealing with it. However, in the field of proposals made by the human rights movement at this stage, the proposals are not forward-looking. to include new matters, except on the issues of informatics and data protection, where many NGOs raise issues before the world started to discuss it. So a forward-looking would mean that we should, in our proposal from the civil society, take into consideration that the coming decades will see a new confrontation worldwide between powers, no longer between Moscow and Washington, but probably between Beijing and Washington, and maybe Beijing and somewhere else. So the world is changing, and those who have now a stronger position in the world than they had before have still the issues of the past, and we should not forget it. The issue is colonialism. Now, human rights groups should react to the issue of colonialism, which is a draft proposal of China, by saying, okay, we accept to take seriously into consideration the issue of colonialism and impact for human rights, on the condition that we contribute to no repetition, which means no neo-colonialism. The situation in West Papua is the situation of neo-colonialism. And the Tibetans would tell you exactly the same. So if we can broaden this, then we are looking forward. But we take the issues of those who were silent before. I never heard Chinese diplomats speaking out in the 80s in the UN. And now, not only they are the first to speak, but they are also listened to and taken seriously. So the world has changed.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Zoller. Todd, you would like to add something?
Sure. I think in this case, Alejandro makes an important point in that, you know, a lot of the mechanisms, the way they function, do relate to a violation that has happened today or yesterday or a month ago. And that often we are in a reactive state in the mechanisms themselves, whether that's the committees or the special rapporteurs. It is difficult to, with all of the violations happening, to take a step back and to start thinking about, well, what are the issues that we're going to be confronting in the near future? And that in this case, at times, there are Human Rights Council resolutions that could actually point to issues of the future that aren't specific to today, or issues that could become worse in the future. I think we've recently seen, for example, the resolution of the Human Rights Council related to the right to a clean and healthy environment. This has taken a number of years to recognize, and it's certainly not necessarily in front of the problem. We're just recognizing it today, but for years we've had problems related to the environment. But if we were to take some issues of technology, let's say neurotechnologies and the ability to change and enhance one's mental capacities by implementation of computer enhancements. These are things that we know are happening, and what GESDA is part of the discussion in terms of anticipating how those may affect our world. I think what's important is that GESDA and other organizations like them and academics begin to use a human rights assessment or analysis of the new technologies from the beginning, and not wait for us to create some type of treaty that creates a hard law, but that I think the best way forward is to create really interpretations of current law that exists in the new context, and to do it very early. And I think that that is would be an incredible service, because as artificial intelligence, neurotechnologies, human enhancement, all of these types of technologies that are in development can affect rights. But what we need also is for the activist community to be identifying that and to be articulating them and to be pushing the United Nations. And then they could use even a model that exists in terms of creating soft law, which is the Secretary General can appoint a special representative, or the High Commissioner can create some type of expert panel that can help to actually flush out the application of human rights to a particular problem. An example of that, of course, is the Ruggie, John Ruggie's work, that while there was efforts for many years to create a binding agreement relative to human rights in business, he was appointed by the Secretary General and was able to produce a certain amount of, let's say, important material to indicate how current human rights apply to this sector. Still not a binding treaty, but soft law that's important. And so I do think it is important that we find ways of dealing with new technologies, because we certainly lost in terms of how social media can be super helpful in terms of access to information, and how detrimental it can be in terms of misinformation. So we do need to get out in front of some of these problems of the future, but we need help, because we're not capable of responding to all of the issues that we're confronted with. And so we very much hope that different NGOs can help on those types of issues. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Todd. We'd like to change a little bit the topic now, to turn to David Droer's question that he spelled out in the chat column regarding the role of the informal sector, that, as you know, is a main player in the economy of many, particularly many developing countries, and the LDCs in particular. And he is very rightly concerned about the fact that these citizens that constitute this informal, invisible, almost invisible sector are not taken into account. The informal sector view governments as part of the problem and not the solution. And businesses, to a great extent, operating in the informal sector as well, but not paying taxes, not following any international norms on human rights, technological, financial standards, and so on. So his question is the main challenge now for the UN to convert its modus operandi to become relevant in dealing with the informal sector, to understand it better, to provide protections to the informal sector that represent groups that are extremely vulnerable in the society. I would like to know if you have views on that, or if you're aware of recent discussions regarding the role and the protection of the informal sector within the broad machinery of the human rights. Both of you, Mr. Zoller, Todd, whoever would like to address the question.
I guess I could go.
Sure.
Is that it's an important comment and question, in that today we see more and more people living in a precarious situation. In fact, there's some authors that call them the precariat, that exist in the gig economy, that exist working from one informal job to another. And that I think that what's important is sort of twofold, is that one, the Secretary General's pronouncements, the High Commissioner's pronouncements relative to the new social contract and the idea of building back fairer, building back better, all of this relates to the idea that there should be a people-centered or a human rights-centered economy, where that the economy is there not necessarily just to make money for specific individuals, but that there is policies that are guided by the human rights framework. Because we are, and I think the comments before of Professor Zoller and others in terms of the need to eradicate poverty, otherwise the UN will really lose its credibility. Because for years we've been saying we're fighting poverty, but the situation seems to, especially in the context of COVID, becoming worse. And the exacerbation of income inequalities. The informal sector does receive some treatment by the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights of the United Nations, and one can find a few cases related to it. I think what most importantly, the cases relate to social protection in terms of, the fact that the state has created a system where only formal employees are paying into some type of Social Security or social protection system, that this is inadequate to meet the obligations of the state under the Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. That there is a need that all people receive some type of social protection. There's a number of interesting decisions and comments related to this issue. I think also what was interesting is just this week we had an intersessional panel that was organized, of course, by the office at the request of the governments of Namibia, South Africa, and of Finland. And in there, I think for one of the few cases in recent memory at the council, we actually had the full grouping of different, let's say, states speak in favor of the need to reinforce the right to Social Security, social protection. This was extremely important because there's a recognition in the context of COVID that the informal sector was particularly hard hit in terms of the lack of social net because of the reality of so many states having only a system of social protection that relates to formal employment and payment into the system. So I think we see a little bit of movement relative to the Human Rights Council and the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights on this problem. It needs to go much further in terms of moving from a recognition to actual changes in the legislative framework and the operationalization of that legislative framework, because we've seen, and this is the strange thing, if economic development and economic growth, even defined by GDP, is the objective, which it should not be, but if it is, those investments in social protection of the informal sector are actually necessary to help facilitate greater growth. And so we have a disconnect between what we know in terms of obligations, what we know in terms of economic growth, and what's happening. And so that indicates a need for change. So thanks for the question.
Thank you, Todd. Professor Zoller?
I think I have little to add to what has been said. It is perfect. We have launched as a Geneva for Human Rights last year at the beginning of the COVID crisis, an appeal for solidarity and support. And this was focusing indeed on the informal sector. And because everyone could see that this was the main issue, we were happy to see that several special rapporteurs have taken it up seriously, and that gradually the Human Rights Council, after now several weeks, not to say months, of hesitation to make one short statement on COVID and human rights, suddenly the Council included this element of impact of COVID for people in its resolution. So it's also going in the right direction, but obviously so slowly. Difficulty is that if I speak now as NGO, informal sector is difficult to place in the compartmentalization of NGOs we have. You work on climate, on development, on civil political rights, against torture. And yeah, you have what to do, shall we do with informal sector? Where to place it? And if you have not a strong coalition of NGOs raising it, the UN experts who have already started to discuss it will not be supported by concrete proposals. And the academic not. I was called by the Geneva University last year and requested to change 2 paragraphs of my article on the role of NGOs in the UN. Because these 2 paragraphs, I spoke about ILO, and the university told me social rights are not human rights. It is ILO, it is not UN. The mentality of the world around the international intergovernmental organizations is often an obstacle. And this mentality is called Geneva International. To inaugurate buildings, to take new initiatives. And some initiatives are very useful. There is no doubt. It's fine to have a support, but it would be more effective to have a support by people who understand. And the local people, yeah, there is a gap. Not only with the field in Africa, but also a gap with the local Geneva.
Yeah, thank you for this useful reminder, Mr. Zoller. We are here in Geneva, indeed. We hear you, and we can witness that every day in all the areas, in all the topics, by the way, not only human rights. Ricardo has another question, an interesting one, regarding the politicization of NGOs. And he says human rights NGOs, especially NGOs particularly, are subject to accusations of politicization in their statements and declarations, and they risk having their relations with the UN suspended, while states always make human rights a political battle. The transition from the Commission on Human Rights to the Human Rights Council has not changed these practices. So how to avoid the discrimination and unfair treatment of the quote and unquote politicization of NGOs, while the first political players are the states themselves? Again, a question for both of you, of course.
Then I would speak first as NGO.
Sure.
Look, it's easy to blame. But first, NGOs should work more to improve the quality of their interventions and of their proposals. And there are many NGOs who try to do so. And when you have quality interventions, the accusation of politicization is not so important. So it is not the problem. The problem is which type of NGOs. So we obviously, some NGOs work on specific issues. This is not politicization. They work on climate, they work on torture, they work on Sri Lanka, on Colombia. That's fine. But if I work on Colombia, I have to be ready to condemn all the violations and abuses, including those committed by non-state actors. If I am not in favor that Colombia ratifies the ICC, as this was a debate in Colombia 20 years ago, some NGOs, good human rights NGOs, were opposed to the ratification of the ICC, the Rome statutes, because they were too close to some guerrillas. This is no longer acceptable, and this is indeed the politicization. if politicization is only the accusation against states, yeah, everything is politics. This is not the problem. We have to really improve the quality. And some NGOs have a high quality. And therefore, the accusation against these NGOs is very weak. But to answer to Ricardo, the main problem in the UN is the source of information in the field of human rights. And Todd said it already, that how difficult it is for the Secretariat to check the accuracy of the information. And there are words which are added to some resolutions adopted by the Human Rights Council, in particular, genuine information, adequate information. Now, the states mean by this their information. Governmental information is genuine, is authentic, and the non-governmental information is politics. Now, obviously, I mean, if you look at all the texts adopted by the UN so far, at the Human Rights Program, at the procedures, now this is not the way the experts, the UN mechanism are considering the quality of the information. And everyone knows that when a particular government does not lie, it does not necessarily tell the truth. This is public knowledge, isn't it? So for me, my concern for the future is the information. This is battle of information, and it is worse since the beginning of the Trump administration. There is no doubt about it.
Thank you, Professor Zoller. I'm sure Todd has something to add from his own perspective and experience on this politicization of NGOs, where the accusation of politicization of NGOs.
Thanks, Manuela. One of the challenges we have is that the UN is made up of member states, and that often the forums that are provided and the mechanisms we provide are also an extension of certain tensions that exist between those member states. And that those tensions carry over into those, let's say, civil society organizations that are also friendly to those member states. And so often we'll find at the Human Rights Council, when given the opportunity, we'll have a number of statements that are either for or against a particular country's position that really reflects the member states and not necessarily a profound analysis of the human rights situation going on in the country. And I don't necessarily know how one would, because restricting access perhaps isn't going to actually produce a better result. I think Professor Zoller has spoken about the need for human rights organizations to really take seriously, as all member states should, the full spectrum of human rights. And I think this has been a real challenge, because I think all too often human rights is used not as a mechanism to improve the lives of people, but very much as part of an extension of political tensions, where member states will point out a particular problem, those civil society organizations support them will point out the same problem, but we do need to just look at the situation in a more holistic way. I think that it's difficult in an organization like our own to think about restrictions of access. I think what we need is actually greater access, so that we can make sure that, all of the violations that could be happening are coming out in let's say an appropriate and extensive way, so it can help the debates in the council and in the mechanisms. Thanks, Manuela.
Yeah, thank you, Todd. Thank you, both of you. Alejandro, you have a comment, I think, regarding the role of education on human rights. Maybe you would like to elaborate on that, Alejandro?
Yes, thank you very much, and apologies for taking the floor again. But yesterday at the Graduate Institute, we had the launch of the first Kofi Annan Peace Talk organized by the Kofi Annan Foundation. And we had the former president of Liberia and Nobel laureate, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. And she stressed very highly, very importantly, the role of education in changing the world, in moving to the paradise that Professor Zoller mentioned, moving to a better stages, the role of education. In the case of my own field of professional activities, which are pensions, I know that we all find out that there's something like life expectancy and pensions too late. I wonder if we all have sufficient human rights literacy and human rights education since we are, for children or for youth. Does that, it's a void that should be filled, or the situation is satisfactory? What do you think about education as a role and as an enabler of human rights?
Professor Zoller, I think you are in the middle of the question because you're a trainer on that.
Yeah, yes and no. Because over the last 20 years, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has become a main producer of documents for education and for different sectors of the society, on different rights. And I think that now the next stage is, for me, it is dissemination, and it is organizing meetings in order to read it out, in order to find we have to train trainers. Education is not simply something like this. You need to have people who can do it. And you find it in the technical assistance of the office. You find it also in some NGOs. Not in all the NGOs in the field, but some NGOs have a practice of educating people, organizing seminars, workshops, and so on. It has to become broader. And for this, my only comment would be that we would need more in the field of education, UNESCO, and also the research institutes we have in Europe and everywhere in the world, the academics who specialize in human rights, in humanitarian law. They should play their role, as it is starting to occur in Geneva. So we see a little bit this. It's fine. But it is indeed very important.
But I think you can fully agree on
the
that.
Products of the Office of the High Commissioner. You will be impressed. I mean, Todd could tell it more, better than I do.
Well, I think that our problem is not now necessarily the production of the type of training materials and educational materials. As Professor Zoller points out, it's how do we actually help people use them to change their situation? And this is a much more difficult and much more resource intensive than most people would think. When we have human rights violations and populations left behind, there are structural reasons for that, complex structural reasons that could run a gamut of different causes. And typically, accompaniment of that type of community that is on the receiving end of violations, whether that is a lack of access to drinkable water or abuses by the police, it's not an easy situation, and that human rights needs to be something that's exercised. And so knowing your rights and using your rights is the best education. Then people see it and people understand it, and then you can start to facilitate the transformations that human rights really, the promise of human rights, that's really what it is. But our challenge is that we don't have the resources. I mean, I remember when I was working in Angola, and we were talking about, okay, let's work in a few different communities and see what the community wants to learn about and work on human rights. And we found that oftentimes it was just the practical things like access to education, and they didn't really know who to speak with, and they were afraid to speak with the relevant government authorities to try to push for this. And so even if you say you have a right to education, there was a whole, let's say, months and months of work that was required to accompany that community, to know who they needed to speak with, to go with them, because there is fear in terms of standing up for one's rights, and that to legitimize the idea that people could stand up, and then achieving a change in terms of distribution of resources within the state to respond to their demand, a fantastic project that required years of a few people for one small community. And so this is, I think, our problem, is that we underestimate the challenges people have in applying the knowledge, the principles, given the realities, the many obstacles and challenges they face. And so here we just really need to use that community approach to partnering and to seeing how far we can get to helping, to actual use of those principles to change lives. And people then will see it, and people will imitate it, and then we'll see greater change. And so we hope to translate some of those materials that we've been investing into to real change that benefits people's lives. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Todd. We are running out of time, and I would like just to close, to wrap up this discussion that could go on for I don't know how many hours, just by flagging two key words that come to my mind, and in that I join, in one of the key words, I join Ricardo's comment right now in the chat. One key word is sovereignty, national sovereignties that continue to be the pillar of the multilateral system, and therefore clash with the whole idea, the core idea of multilateral cooperation and multilateral machinery. So sovereignty is still there. And then the other key word that flashes in my mind all the time is we need democratic regimes. We need more democracy to ensure human rights in the first place, because with authoritarian regimes, we don't go anywhere. So these two issues, together with the reduction of poverty that was flagged by Professor Zoller at the beginning as one of the underlying concerns that affects everything that we can do on human rights, these are reflections that deserve more great talks. I would like now to give the floor to Alejandro for some closing words.
Well,
and thank you everybody for the participation. Alejandro, please.
Well, thank you very much, Manuela. I just would like to thank Professor Soler and Tor Holland for a very rich and enlightening session. It really was, as we expected, full of information. I learned a lot. You walked us through the challenges, difficulties, and complexities, and also the process in the last 70 years. The forgotten topics, even including slavery, racism, and colonialism. And I also learned that human rights is an objective and a tool. And many thanks for your participation. Many thanks to all who participated. And if you allow me, I just would like to mention that this is the first talk on human rights that we're having. We're having a series of 3 talks. This was the first one, and we have 2 more. One on November 22nd on genocide and crimes against humanity with Philip Sands, who is academician and writer, and on December 8th with Adiba Kasim, who is a researcher, refugee, and herself, she's a Yazidi survivor. So some of the points that were highlighted during this great talk is hearing those who have been actors or have suffered from human rights violation. I think these two additional sessions will be as enriching and enlightening as this one. Thank you very much, Professor Soler. Thank you very much, Todd, and looking forward to see you in the next great talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.